Hello and welcome to Herstory, episode 1, the Assassin's Creed edition. Kidding. Episode 1, Elizabeth the First. The coolest woman ever. And that's why she's Elizabeth the First. Excuse my mess, I have a life. This is our spare bedroom, and all of those lovely pictures on the wall there are all exhibitions that I've been involved in, so all very dear to my heart and very lovely. Anyway, without further ado, I've managed to condense Liz down into a page and 2/3, a page and 3/4. So hopefully I will be able to do this in 15 minutes. I will try my very hardest, but because it is my first episode, why is that on my nose? My first episode, and a woman that I deeply, truly love and adore, it might be a little bit longer, but we will see. So, Elizabeth I, born on the 7th of September 1533, and she is the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. So Henry VIII has married Catherine of Aragon, and they've had Mary, okay? Now, this is the very famous divorced, beheaded, died, right? So, Catherine is getting to the age where she's not feasibly going to have any more children, so Henry has a complete tantrum. This is really in a nutshell, I'm being really unfair to Henry here, but Henry has a tantrum and breaks with the Catholic Church in Rome, who say that divorce isn't allowed, and he says, well, I'll just make my own church then. Ugh. And he divorces Catherine and marries Anne Boleyn, and they have Elizabeth in September 1533. And as we all know, things don't go too well for Anne Boleyn, bless her heart. She ends up being beheaded in 1536 when Elizabeth is the tender age of about 2.5, 3. So that can't have been very pleasant for her. Henry then goes on to marry Jane Seymour, who has a son called Edward, who is Elizabeth's half-brother. So she's got an older half-sister and a younger half-brother. And then Jane Seymour dies shortly after giving birth to Edward. And then we have Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, who finally outlives Henry, but that is another subject for another day. So just a little bit of background. If you want more background on that information, Six Wives of Henry VIII by Alison Weir is a cracking book. So she's the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. She's not the firstborn, Mary is the firstborn, and she's actually the last of Henry's kids to inherit the throne, because when he dies, his son Edward takes the throne. Edward is only 15, I think, at the time. He's a very sickly kid, and he dies after a few years of tuberculosis. He then tries to put his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne, which, as you probably know, doesn't work out very well for her, bless her. Mary, the oldest child, who is female, says, hang on a minute, who's she? My crown. And comes up here to my neck of the woods, to Framlingham, and summons an army and goes down there and like Daenerys Targaryens, that stuff, and takes the crown for herself and executes Lady Jane Grey. So that's older sister. And then when Mary finally passes away after her 4-year reign in 1558, in November 1558, Elizabeth finally becomes queen. And she remains queen until her death in March 1603. So she lived to the age of 69, which is pretty good innings for someone of that age. Sorry, my dog's doing weird things. Like, the dogs have been removed. I sense this is going to be a thing, removing the dogs. Yeah, so she's commonly referred to as the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, or Good Queen Bess. Those are some of her common nicknames. And the reason why I love her was because she was a woman in a man's world. She really the first female monarch in her own right, not as kind of part partnership, like Matilda and that kind of thing. The first female monarch was her sister, her older sister Mary, and there had been such a turbulent time of it before Elizabeth came to the throne. So obviously Henry VIII had the fallout with Rome, and he was like, we're all Protestant now, but he was still kind of a Catholic at heart, and he practiced Catholicism and sort of went back to Catholic ways towards the end of his life. His son then inherits the throne, Edward, and Edward is a Protestant. He's pretty damn Protestant. So you've got a few years of Edward's Protestant realm. Then Mary becomes queen, and this is why Edward wants Lady Jane Grey to be queen, so that she can carry on the Protestantism. Mary becomes queen, and she's a Catholic, and she is famously called Bloody Mary because she likes to execute people that aren't Catholic. She likes to burn people, and she was not a very nice lady. We will do an episode on her. She deserves her own episode. But Elizabeth came along. Elizabeth is a Protestant, but she says, do you know what, guys, we've just had years and years and years of religious turmoil and persecution, and she takes the Church of England and she creates the Elizabethan settlement, and it is the Church of England settlement that we still have in this country to this day, which is mental. Just digest that for a minute. We still have the Elizabethan church settlement in the Church of England today, right? Because it's a tolerant policy. So she basically says, I'm a Protestant woman, we are a Protestant country, I don't really care what you do in your own home, just show up to Protestant church on a Sunday. You can go home and say your mass and do whatever you want, just live and let live. And that was one of the first things she did upon becoming a monarch. Now, when you become a queen, you're expected to marry somebody. Liz never did that, which is why she has gone down in history as the Virgin Queen. She didn't want a man, because in that day and age, everyone would look to her husband for what to do instead of to her. She'd seen from the death of her mother that marriage doesn't always work out that well, really. And so she had decided, I think very early on, that she was not going to marry, not at all. Liz was really well educated. She was crazy clever. She played something silly like 8 different musical instruments, and she spoke 9 languages. She spoke English, French, Italian, Spanish, Latin, Greek, Welsh, Irish, and Scottish, because they're all individual nation states at that point. That's bonkers. Like, she was crazy smart, okay? While her sister Mary's on the throne, she's being kept in the Tower of London because obviously Mary's Catholic, Liz is Protestant. She doesn't want any Protestant uprisings, so she keeps her sister locked away in the Tower of London, and then when she can't find any dirt that Elizabeth is plotting against her, she puts her under house arrest in Hatfield House. And it's there that Elizabeth gets the news that her sister has died, and she is now the queen. So, yeah, as I say, one of the first things she does is she creates the Elizabethan church settlement, which is very progressive. It's very tolerant for its time. She never married. She was an expert. She was such an expert in dangling men on a hook. She had so many suitors, because to look at her through modern day eyes, okay, she's not necessarily what we would call a catch now, but she was the Queen of England. You know, that carries quite a bit of weight, and that makes her a bit of a prize. But she was so good. She would manage to turn these men down and still make them fiercely loyal to her. It was crazy. So obviously the Pope doesn't like the fact that there's this tolerant, troublesome woman on the throne. And in 1570, he declares her illegitimate. He says that Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII's marriage, it was not able to, you couldn't get a divorce. Divorce was not a thing. Henry just like made that up. So the marriage to Anne Boleyn was not legitimate, and therefore Elizabeth was not legitimate, and therefore could not be a legitimate queen. So that was what he said, and that caused lots of threats to her life, and it caused Catholics to kind of rise up and say, well, we've got Mary Queen of Scots who's Catholic, let's put her on the throne instead. So this is where the whole Mary Queen of Scots debacle comes from, and this is where the Spanish Armada comes from. The Spanish Armada was one of the greatest military victories in English history. I literally cannot stress how awesome, England, we rocked, okay? That happens in 1588. So the Spanish are under Philip II. Philip II was married to Mary. Then Mary dies. Philip wants to marry Elizabeth. Elizabeth says no. Philip gets annoyed. So he says, I don't like you because you're Protestant. Long story short, he's bitter that she wouldn't marry him. Anyway, he sent 130 ships to invade England. And the aim was to put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne and restore Catholicism to England, right? So what Elizabeth does is she gets her best menses together. She gets her Francis Drakes and of this world, and she gets her Robert Dudleys. We'll talk a little bit about him later. And she gets them all together, and she builds this incredible naval fleet, which is bananas and out of this world. And she rides down to Tilbury, where all the soldiers are stationed, and she rides out on a white horse wearing full plate armor and directly addresses the troops. And there's a very famous speech, it's called the Tilbury speech, and I'm sure you will have heard part of it, but this is the majority of it, and I've abridged it slightly just so that it makes sense in our kind of modern day language. But this is what she says. She rides out to address her soldiers on a white horse wearing full body armor, and she says, "Let tyrants fear that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you in the midst and heat of battle, to live or die amongst you all, to lay down my life for God and my kingdom and my people, my honour and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. By your obedience to my general, by your concord in camp and your valour in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over those enemies of my God, of my kingdom, and of my people." Stirring stuff, huh? So quite often you hear the line, I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. And that's quite a popular thing. A lot of you might be thinking, that's not a very feminist thing to say, but you have to think about the age and the time, and they're like, a woman on the throne, really? So it's quite a rousing speech, and the English go on to absolutely trounce the Spanish. It is an incredible victory. Just let me read some of these stats to you. So, Philip II sent 130 ships to invade England. On the English side of things, 100 people died and 400 were wounded. Typhus then came along and killed between 6,000 to 8,000 people on the English side, but actual battle, 500 to 100 dead and 400 wounded. On the Spanish, 20,000 dead and 800 wounded. That's nuts. Basically, the weather was not on Spain's side. The fleet scattered and under our firepower and bad weather, and it all went horribly to pot, and there was rejoicing in the towns and in the cities of England, and everybody was really happy, and they appreciated the fact that, oh, thank goodness we're not going to get invaded by Spain. Lovely. So that brings me on to the reason why I really like Liz. One of the many reasons why I like Liz is because she was a people's queen. She kind of invented the modern day press tour, if you like. You know, when someone releases a movie and they go on a press tour to talk about it, she kind of invented that. Every year she would go on what was called Progress. She would travel around the country, stay at noble people's houses at their expense, which was great. So she saved loads of money by doing that, and they would have to put her up, and all of her servants and all of her groomsmen and all of her staff and everything, and she would go around the country on Progress, and she would see the common people, touch the common people. She was the first monarch to actually put herself out there and say, hey, nice to meet you, I'm Liz. She didn't say that, but you know what I mean. The woman was a propaganda machine. Every portrait that you see of Elizabeth has symbology in it. Quite often you will see her wearing pearls, which are a sign of chastity, which reinforces that Virgin Queen thing. Quite often you will see there are eyes in her portraits. So she's saying she sees everything, she knows everything, she's aware of all these plots that are happening. I'm aware of you, Mary Queen of Scots. I'm aware of you. And there's symbology everywhere. So quite often, one of the most famous portraits of her is the Armada portrait, and in the back of that is a backdrop of ships, and it's just reinforcing the naval prowess of the country and everything like that. Quite often she's carrying her orb and scepter, so she's reinforcing her status as queen, and she's covered in jewels, and there is symbology everywhere if you look for it. So she was pretty savvy on propaganda. She never married, but there was this one chap called Robert Dudley, Robbie as she called him. She'd known him since they were kids. When she was in the Tower, he was in the Tower too, because his brother was married to Lady Jane Grey. It's all a bit intermingled at this point. But yeah, his brother Guildford Dudley was married to Lady Jane Grey. So they were in the Tower together, and they were just the closest of friends. They were completely in love with one another, and if she was ever going to marry anyone, it would have been him. But unfortunately, he was already married to a woman called Amy Robsart, and Amy Robsart died in a strange, unfortunate accident where she fell or was pushed down the stairs. And after that, Liz was like, no, I can't marry you. Even if you didn't do away with your wife, the scandal, I'm not having it. Plus, I don't need no man, and I don't want you to be the one in charge, because I'm the queen here. So her and Robert Dudley marrying never happened. What he actually did was he went and married one of her ladies in waiting called Lettice Knollys. Yes, you heard that right. Her name was Lettice, Littice, not Lettuce. And Lettice looked exactly like Elizabeth. Like I cannot even describe how close they look. I think they were like second cousins or something like that. They were related, and they looked so similar. And ladies in waiting at that point were not allowed to get married without the Queen's permission. So quite often they would have a little dalliance with somebody. They would get pregnant. They would come to the Queen, and she would say, "Okay, you can marry him. Go away and marry him quietly." And sorry, there's a car. There's a car outside. Just ignore the noise. I was waiting for the dogs to stop barking, but I don't think they ever will. Someone pulled up in their car outside, and then the dogs want to tell me all about it, so apologies for the noise. Yes, so normally ladies in waiting would end up pregnant, and then they would come to Elizabeth and she would say, oh, just marry him and, you know, bugger off, stop causing me problems. Lettice Knollys and Robert Dudley went and got married in secret, which was not a good idea. So Dudley basically married Liz's lookalike in secret. And when Elizabeth found out, she was so angry, she broke Lettice's finger. Not one of her finer moments. But I'm trying to give a balanced picture here. She was awesome, but she could also be quite angry at certain things. But this was the love of her life, so I do kind of get it a little bit. It was a man that she probably wanted to marry every single day of her life, but had to talk herself out of doing so. So yeah, I get it. A lot of common questions that people ask about Elizabeth. The main one seems to be, why the makeup, why the white face? The answer to that is she had smallpox when she was younger, when she was about 25, and she was left with scars all over her face and like pitting and pock marks all over her face because of it. So it was to cover that up. It was basically a 1500s foundation, which was unfortunately made of lead, which ate away at the skin, made the holes bigger, perpetuated the issue. So that's where the white face makeup comes from, basically. Other awesome things about Elizabeth are her overseas exploration, not hers personally, but Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh went off and explored the globe. And Francis Drake in particular liked to annoy the Spanish, which was kind of funny in light of the Spanish Armada. So Drake was a privateer, which is the very early term for pirate, basically, and they went over to the New World, and it's thanks to them that we have potatoes and sugar and tobacco and all those other lovely things. So finally, in February 1603, Elizabeth lost many people that were close to her. She lost, towards the end of her life, she'd lost Robert Dudley, and she always, she had a cameo ring of him and her mother that she'd kept, and she kept his last letter to her in a box. And she'd lost a lot of people that were very close to her. She'd lost Cat Ashley, who was her governess, who'd been with her since she was a child. She'd lost one of her cousins. She'd lost a lot of very important people to her in quick succession. And she remained in a settled and unremovable melancholy and sat motionless on a cushion for hours and hours on end. And when her advisor, Robert Cecil, who was the son of William Cecil, who'd been her advisor since she took the throne for a very long time, when Robert Cecil said to her she must go to bed, she said, "Must is not a word to use to princes, little man." Love it. But finally she does go to bed, and she lays down and she passes away quietly at the very good age at that time of 69. She was buried at Westminster Abbey on the 28th of April 1603 with her sister Mary, which is a weird twist, considering all that they'd been through together. You know, your sister locks you up in the tower, and then her husband wants to marry you, and it's all a little bit weird. And Mary kind of always hated Elizabeth because of the whole marriage thing with Anne Boleyn, and she didn't think her sister was legitimate, and that caused a lot of problems. So the fact that Elizabeth still had love for Mary was quite touching, really. And the inscription on their tomb, which is in Latin, it translates to "Consort in realm and tomb, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection." So even after all they'd been through, Liz was still saying, hey, girl power, you know, we did well. We did some queen stuff, you know. After Elizabeth died, she left the throne to Mary Queen of Scots' son, James, James I of England and the 6th of Scotland. Mary Queen of Scots is something that I haven't really touched on here. I will touch on it more. I will do an episode on Mary Queen of Scots. As you know, the Armada came over. They wanted to overthrow Elizabeth and put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne, and this compiled with so many threats and plots that were going on from Mary Queen of Scots basically forced Elizabeth's hand. She had to execute her because she was never going to be stable on the throne with all these plots going on. She was never going to be able to, like, not sleep with one eye open until Mary was gone. But it took a lot out of her to sign the execution warrant, and I think it was probably the most difficult decision she ever had to make. But we will talk about that more in Mary Queen of Scots' video because she deserves one for herself. So after James comes to the throne, he's seen it, although he's Protestant, he's seen as a bit of a Catholic sympathiser, and he's not all that popular. So Liz kind of gets heralded as this heroine of this golden age of religious tolerance, and where the crown and the church and the parliament are all working together really well. And yeah, it's just seen as this kind of peaceful golden era kind of thing. And I just want to end with one of my favourite quotes, which was a quote which was said by Pope Sixtus V. This is the one that excommunicated her and claimed her illegitimate. He said, "She is only a woman, only mistress of half an island, and yet she makes herself feared by Spain, by France, by the Empire, and all." The Empire in this case refers to the Holy Roman Empire, which made up Spain, Germany, all the way to Italy, basically, and it was all run by the King of Spain, apart from Rome and the Vatican, which was run by the Pope. So the empire was run by the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the King of Spain. So yeah, I think that just sums it up really. She was a woman. She was a woman in a man's world. She didn't let anybody push her around. She didn't let anybody tell her what to do. She managed to be peaceful, yet stand her ground at the same time. Tolerant, affectionate, but also, you know, no one could mess with her. She was smart, she was savvy, and she learned from the mistakes that other powerful women like her mother and her sister had made before her. I just love her, and Elizabeth I is the reason I fell in love with history in the first place. So if you know nothing about Elizabeth I, as I say, if you want to know a bit of background on Henry VIII, The Six Wives of Henry VIII by Alison Weir is a great book. If you want to ease yourself in to Elizabeth I and learn more about her relationship with Robert Dudley and the death of his wife, Amy Robsart, The Virgin's Lover by Philippa Gregory is a fantastic book. It's written from a fictional perspective, but Philippa Gregory does a lot of research. She knows her onions, so take it with a pinch of salt, but it's very good. And then, of course, as in my last video, Alison Weir's Elizabeth the Queen is the Bible for me on Elizabeth. It is a factual book, and it is quite deep and in depth. So it's quite a weighty tome, probably not the best one to start with. And then finally, I absolutely love Elizabeth Renaissance Prince by Lisa Hilton, and this talks about her being a woman in a man's world and more about her sort of her prowess in military in the military side of things. And it's just about how awesomely militant and heroic she was. So yeah, there we go. If you want to learn more about Elizabeth, that is the place to start. I hope you love her as much as I do. I hope I've inspired you to go and find out some more about her if you didn't already know about her. And I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you next week for another instalment of Herstory.